insane. Almost. My wife B died during childbirth. She was gorgeous, funny, intelligent, stubborn. A woman whose laugh was so loud, eating in restaurants was a challenge. A woman whose stare was so intense, it made my hands shake. I lost her as she gave birth to our daughter, Sam. Of course, I could have resented Sam for taking away what was once mine in a way nothing else can be, for taking what was so truly and utterly pure, but I didn't. I knew B wouldn't want any resentment. She wouldn't have wanted our only child to have a life ruined by hate. But this isn't about grief. This isn't about the physical sucker punch of losing forever something you loved. This is about something far more sinister. My daughter was lively, always running and screaming, leaping up and down the climbing frame, causing havoc in her classes. So for her 6th birthday, a trip with friends to the movies had left her so pent up with energy I could barely keep up with her as she dipped and dodged between people on the pavement. She'd occasionally turn back through the sea of people and shout, "Daddy, come on," in a tone that was almost petulant. I couldn't help but love her. I tried to chase her, I really did. She was too busy looking at me when she dashed out into the road, and the bus didn't have time to stop. A sickening crunch, and the world fell silent. I cradled her broken form in my arms, too numb to weep, too hurt to move. All I could feel was the warm crimson liquid gently seep into my clothes. In the state of shock I was in, I could just think about how I was going to wash my jeans. It sounds horrid, I know, but a loss like that tears everything away from you, and leaves you with only the bare thought process that humans can make. The next week was a blur. I cannot place a single memory to a time, in between friends and family extending their condolences, and the howling sobs of mine that would break out at any moment. I attended her funeral dressed all in black. By dressed I don't mean merely clothes. My very essence was dark. I couldn't feel or think, and the day continued as I went through the motions, like a dying man treading water. Everyone wanted to tell me about Sam, and how perfect she was. What an angel she was, as if I didn't know. As if I didn't realize what a gift my own daughter was. The man stood out from the rest, as he walked up to me and handed me this large leather book. I assumed at the time he was a parent of one of Sam's friends, handing me a collection of their photos together. Or maybe I was too numb to even process his cold hands, and how he never mentioned my daughter once. For a month I was lost. I drank and stayed in our now empty apartment alone, watching old box sets, too numb now to even cry. It was only when my sister arrived, when she held my hand and talked to me, that I began to come out of my shell. She'd sit and listen to the most inane things I said, and gently coaxed me out of my depression. Not completely, but enough for me to begin to live what was almost real life again. That was when I opened the book. I decided to remember Sam for all the joy she gave, and was prepared to reflect on her life without feeling miserable. I opened the first page. It was essentially a binder full of Polaroid photos of my daughter growing up. I furrowed my brow. They were taken from a distance, blurred slightly, and I was in a few of them. I began to feel sick, face of my daughter's wife without a sense of trepidation. The photos grew closer and closer to my daughter's birthday. I could see the day I gave her a tiny bike after she turned 5, and the skinned knees that ensued. The book had so many more pages that I assumed the rest were empty. But there was a photo of her just before the movies on her 6th birthday. I could recognize the pink raincoat she insisted on wearing, and my hands on her shoulders. There was no photo of the crash. Instead, her life continued inside this book. Her 7th birthday had a photo of me and her in the garden, covered in paint, with a huge canvas on the floor and an extremely messy painting. Her 7th birthday. The reality of what I was seeing hit me. Then I slammed the book shut. I sat there at the kitchen table staring at the leather. This must be some kind of sadistic Photoshop, I hoped. Someone had taken the time to pull a horrid prank on me. I say I hoped because essentially I couldn't believe the other explanation, if there even was one. Gritting my teeth, I decided I had nothing to lose and kept reading. I can't explain the emotions I felt whilst I read accurately, listening to the sound of the page turning. I can try, but nothing could prepare you for something like this. Her life continued, showing her losing her baby to you, her first day of senior school. My turning of the pages became more frenzied, and I began to notice something. The photographer was getting closer. Closer to her as she grew older. Not in every photo, but a general trend. The photographer was getting closer and closer, more daring perhaps. She was beautiful, stunning. As a teenager she looked just like her mother, all curls and smiles. I grew older too, but the photos began to include me less and less. Her 16th birthday was strange. A group of her friends sitting outside, drinking from little plastic cups at a picnic. But there was someone in the background, near the bushes of the park where this was taken. A dark figure stood. You wouldn't have noticed him if not for the small shadow he cast on the grass. I leant back for a moment and exhaled. This was too weird. I'd been so caught up in watching my little girl grow up. I hadn't thought about how this would end. Moments like this are so utterly surreal that sometimes you remove yourself from them. I almost felt like I was watching myself read these, like this was a dream or a program on the TV. I continued. The dark figure became more and more present in each photograph. I could almost make out the features. His presence was towering, and as I turned the page I expected to see him disappear. But instead, as the photographs grew closer to her 18th, each birthday was marked by a caption underneath the Polaroid saying, "Another year." She was no longer somewhere I recognized. Instead, the photos were of her in a dimly lit house. Her face was contorted with fear, striking all sorts of weird poses. Sometimes she would be dressed like an ancient queen, or she would be dressed like a maid scrubbing the floors. The figure was there even closer now. His legs or his arm would appear in each and every one. No matter how she was dressed, in every photo her face had this desperately pained expression. It killed me. There were bruises on her face. She looked thin and ill. I couldn't do it. This was sick, properly sick. I soldiered on. The last photo I looked at before I slammed was looking straight at the camera, crying. She was on her knees, dressed in a black evening dress, with an apple in her mouth and her hands bound behind her back. The makeup was ruined by her tears. It was as if she was pleading me, begging me to help, but I couldn't. I closed the book and left the room, my whole body convulsing with sobs. I couldn't call the police, of course. She was dead. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't the contents of what I saw. It's that there were so many pages left. That was the first story. The second story is called Masterpiece. I've been lying down for hours now. It's 5:35 a.m. and there's not much I can do. You know what the worst part about my situation is? I'm in the same room with my parents. They keep looking at me, and I can't help but look back and try not to cry or scream. Their eyes are focused on me, and their mouths are wide open. There's the strong scent of blood, and I feel so paralyzed with fear. Here's the thing, the second I make any hint that I'm not asleep anymore, I'm completely dead. I will die and there's nobody around to save me. I've been trying to think of a way out, but the only idea I have is to rush for the door and run outside the front door and scream for help, hoping any neighbors might hear me. It's risky, but if I stay here I'll surely die. He's waiting for me to wake up and see his masterpiece. You're probably wondering what's going on. Well, about 3 hours ago, I heard screaming from the other side of the house. I got up and went to check on the noise before realizing I had to use the restroom. Instead of doing the smart thing and investigating, I used the bathroom first. I could have gotten myself killed right then from my stupid actions, but I actually did my business and took a peek outside the bathroom. There was blood on the carpet. I got very worried and ran back to my room, hiding under my sheets. I tried to convince myself to go back to sleep, that it was just some really vivid dream or something. But I heard my bedroom door open. Like the terrified child I was, I peeked from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging my dead parents into the room. It was not human, I can tell you that. It was hairless, with no eyes and no clothes. It walked like a caveman, with its back slouched as it dragged my parents. But this thing was much smarter than any caveman. It was aware of what it was doing. It propped my dad up on the edge of my bed and made him face me. It then sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her towards me as well. It then started rubbing its hands upon the walls, staining them with blood, and then drew a circle with the devil's pentagram on it. This thing had made what it would probably call a masterpiece. To finish it off, it scribbled a message onto the wall that I could not read in the darkness. It then positioned itself under my bed, waiting to strike. The scariest thing is now, my eyes have adjusted to the darkness since then, and I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it because it's terrifying to think about, but I feel I need to see it before I'm killed. I peek at the creature's masterpiece. It says, "I know you're awake." That was story number 2. A little bit shorter. The next story is called The Rake. During the summer of 2003, events in the emotions ranged from extremely traumatic levels of fright and discomfort to an almost childlike sense of playfulness and curiosity. While their published versions are no longer on record, the memories remain powerful. Several of the involved parties began looking for answers that year. In early 2006, the collaboration had accumulated nearly 24 documents dating between the 12th century and the present day, spanning 4 continents. In almost all cases, the stories were identical. I have been in contact with a member of this group and was able to get some excerpts from their upcoming book. Excerpt number 1. A Suicide Note, 1964. As I prepare to take my life, I feel it necessary to assuage any guilt or pain I have introduced through this act. It is not the fault of anyone other than him. For once I awoke and felt his presence, and once I awoke and saw his form. Once again I awoke and heard his voice and looked into his eyes. I cannot sleep without fear of what I might next awake to experience. I cannot ever wake. Goodbye. Found in the same wooden box were 2 empty envelopes addressed to William and Rose, and 1 loose personal letter with no envelope. Dearest Linny, I have prayed for you. He spoke your name. Excerpt number 2. A journal entry translated from Spanish, 1880. I have experienced the greatest terror. I have experienced the greatest terror. I see his eyes when I close mine. They are hollow, black. They saw me and pierced me. His wet hand. I will not sleep. His voice. Excerpt number 3. A mariner's log, 1691. He came to me in my sleep. From the foot of my bed I felt a sensation. He took everything. We must return to England. We shall not return here again at the request of the rake. Excerpt number 4. From a witness, 2006. 3 years ago, I had just returned from a trip from Niagara Falls with my family for the 4th of July. We were all very exhausted after a long day of driving, so my husband and I put the kids right to bed and called it a night. At about 4 a.m., I woke up thinking my husband had gotten up to use the restroom. I used the moment to steal back the sheets, only to wake him in the process. I apologized and told him I thought he got out of bed. When he turned to face me, he gasped and pulled his feet up from the end of the bed so quickly his knee almost knocked me out of the bed. He then grabbed me and said nothing. After adjusting to the dark for half a second, I was able to see what caused the strange reaction. At the foot of the bed, sitting and facing away from us, there was what appeared to be a naked man, or a large hairless dog of some sort. Its body position was disturbing and unnatural, as if it had been hit by a car or something. For some reason I was not instantly frightened by it, but more concerned as to its condition. At this point I was somewhat under the assumption that we were supposed to help him. My husband was peering over his arm and knee, tucked into the fetal position, occasionally glancing at me before returning to the creature. In a flurry of motion, the creature scrambled around the side of the bed, and then crawled quickly in a flailing sort of motion, right along the bed until it was less than a foot from my husband's face. The creature was completely silent for about 30 seconds. then placed its hand on his knee and ran into the hallway leading to the kids' room. I screamed and ran for the light switch, planning to stop him before he hurt my children. When I got to the hallway, the light from the bedroom was enough to see it crouched and hunched over about 20 feet away. He turned around and looked directly at me, covered in blood. I flipped the switch on the wall and saw my daughter Clara. The creature ran down the stairs, while my husband and I rushed to help our daughter. She was very badly injured, and spoke only once more in her short life. She said, "He is the rake." My husband drove his car into a lake that night, while rushing our daughter to the hospital. He did not survive. Being a small town, news got around pretty quickly. The police were helpful at first, and the local newspaper took a lot of interest as well. However, the story was never published, and the local television news never followed up either. For several months, my son Justin and I stayed in a hotel near my parents' house. After we decided to return home, I began looking for answers myself. I eventually located a man in the next town over who had a similar story. We got in contact and began talking about our experiences. He knew of 2 other people in New York who had seen the creature we now referred to as the rake. It took the 4 of us about 2 solid years of hunting on the internet and writing letters to come up with a small collection of what we believed to be accounts of the rake. None of them gave any details, history or follow-up. One journal had an entry involving the creature in its first 3 pages, and then never mentioned it again. The ship's log explains nothing of the encounter, saying only that they were told to leave by the rake. That was the last entry in the log. There were, however, many instances where the creature's visit was one of a series of visits with the same person. Multiple people also mentioned being spoken to, my daughter included. This led us to wonder if the rake had visited any of us before our last encounter. I set up a digital recorder near my bed and left it running all night, every night, for 2 weeks. I would tediously scan through the sound of me rolling around in the bed each day when I woke up. By the end of the 2nd week, I was quite used to the occasional sound of sleep while blaring through the recording at 8 times the normal speed, which still took almost an hour every day. On the first day of the 3rd week, I thought I heard something different. What I found was a shrill voice. It was the rake. I can't listen to it long enough to even begin to transcribe it. I haven't let anyone listen to it yet. All I know is that I've heard it before, and I now believe that it spoke when it was sitting in front of my husband. I don't remember hearing anything at the time, but for some reason, the voice on the recorder immediately brings me back to that moment. The thoughts that must have gone through my daughter's head make me very upset. I have not seen the rake since he ruined my life, but I know that he has been in my room while I slept. I know and fear that one night I'll wake up to see him staring at me. Okay, so the last story that I have for you today is called The Gateway of the Mind. his senses, the scientist performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel, with no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world. He was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of the scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point, he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with a scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." And his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Okay. So, the very, very last story I have for you is called The Quiet Room. Bonus story. I've always loved the movies. As a film fan, my attention would instantly snap to the TV when I caught a commercial for an upcoming movie. Most of the mindless, overproduced garbage Hollywood churns out is pretty forgettable, so whenever I discovered an indie film with a relatively fresh concept, I was excited to see something different. Recently I caught a commercial for an upcoming limited release thriller called Quiet Room, which I found pretty intriguing. The story features a serial killer with a twisted sense of morality, who picks his victims based on what he feels they add or detract from society, and his killing methods reflect how they've hurt others soon to theatres message. I found this to be pretty unsettling, but probably a viral marketing tactic, so I watched some cartoons to settle my mind so I could get to sleep. The next day I ran into my friend Jeff, and we decided to have lunch together. Our conversation eventually led to this bizarre and creepy commercial I saw during SportsCenter. I was shocked to hear that Jeff had also been watching SportsCenter last night, but didn't see the same commercial. Instead, he saw one of the original TV spots. I protested and described it in detail, but he had no clue what I was talking about. Naturally, this left me a little rattled regarding what I saw, but a few days elapsed and I found myself settling back into a normal routine, which included my daily SportsCenter fix. The disturbing commercial had nearly escaped my mind before I saw it again. It seemed the same as before, however everything seemed to be intensified. The wailing was louder, and the dark figures were easily recognizable this time. After collecting my thoughts for a few moments, I quickly called Jeff to ask if he had seen it this time. But again he replied no and hung up, probably thinking this is just a prank. My mind started to lose focus, and I began to doubt what I saw and heard. I went to the kitchen and made myself a snack, watched some more cartoons in the living room to ease my mind, and decided it was time to try to get some sleep. I made my way to my bedroom and was strangely able to find sleep quite easy. In the middle of the night I woke up. I swore I could hear something odd, but couldn't make it out. The unsettling thoughts of quiet room came rushing back into my brain, instantly putting me on edge. I settled down and tried to pinpoint this noise, thinking it was all in my head. It seemed to be the sound of intense wailing, exactly as I had heard it through the TV. Intense panic set in as I pulled the blanket over my head in an attempt to muffle the noise, but it only grew louder. The sadness of these beings saturated my mind. As I tried to block out these horrible voices, I noticed a shadow pass across my blanket, but I was too afraid to pull back the sheets to see if it was just a bird flying by my room, or something sinister lurking inside my room. Suddenly I felt something cold touch my toes from beneath the blanket and curled up into the fetal position in my bed, trembling with fear. A few moments pass before the blanket is ripped out of my grasp and I can see what has entered my room. The image of a thick black figure stood at the side of my bed. There were no ears, nose, or eyes on its head. A wide, grinning mouth was its only defining feature. The urge to scream filled my mind, but nothing escaped my mouth. The creature seemed to soak up the terror I've become saturated with, before it cocks its head gently to the side and thrusts a sharp, piercing claw into my chest. I managed to catch one last glimpse of the creature standing over me, as if utterly satisfied, before everything went silent and black. I woke up lying on the floor. I didn't know how much time had passed, but it was still obviously pitch black outside. I grasped my chest where I was attacked by the creature, but found no wound and no blood. Normally I would give a sigh of relief, since I realized it was simply a nightmare, and I fell out of bed. But all I could feel was dread and intense sadness, the type of heartache you feel the moment you discover a loved one has died. I picked myself up and stumbled to the light switch, but I couldn't find it. The only light coming in was the window. As I examined it, it was far larger than normal and looked otherwise abnormal. As I approached it, I could see words written on it in reverse. It said, "I'm coming." Terror filled my mind as I realized what had happened. away towards the window so I could look out. The only thing I could see was my friend Jeff sitting on his couch, watching us.